So are both absolute advantage and comparative advantage theories similar or same? Is there any similarity between absolute advantage theory and comparative advantage theory? There are many similarities between the two theories, and there are so many differences between the two theories. So let's look the similarities between the two theories before going into the differences. First of all, you have to know that these two theories are the classical trade theories. Classical trade theory means the theory put forward by the classical economists of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Adam Smith introduced absolute advantage theory. David Ricardo introduced comparative advantage theory of trade. Both the theories are classical theories. The classical theories of trade have common assumptions. There are many common, all the assumption, or almost all the assumptions of the theory of one classical theory is absolutely applicable to the other classical theory. So both theories have common assumptions. Let's look some of the assumptions of the classical trade theory. First one is full employment in both nations. There is no chance for any all the laborers in both nations are supposed to be fully employed, and nobody remains unemployed in both nations. So this is a requirement for the theory to be valid. So this is a common assumption. Perfect competition is another common assumption of the two theories. Perfectly competitive market is prevalent in both nations. According to both theories, nobody is able to influence the price. Only cost of production will determine the advantage. And labor is the only factor of production according to the classical theories. There is no capital being employed in the production of commodities in both nations. They did not consider capital as the factor of production. And another common assumption is no transportation cost. There will be no transportation cost. Transportation cost has not been considered in the classical trade theory, as if there is transportation cost, it will make the differences in comparative advantage or absolute advantage. According to the classical trade theories, there will be no trade barrier. So all the assumptions focus on the perfectly competitive market and perfect competition. So there will be no external interference in the price determination. So everything is in line with the market, and there is no capital as well. So all the assumptions are common for both absolute advantage theory and comparative advantage theory. So let's look next the differences between absolute advantage theory and comparative advantage theory. According to absolute advantage theory, international trade or trade is governed by absolute advantage according to the absolute advantage theory, and according to the comparative advantage theory, trade is governed by comparative advantage. Trade means export and import. So export and import of commodities are determined by the comparative advantage according to the comparative advantage theory, absolute advantage according to the absolute advantage theory. A nation should export the commodity on which it has got the absolute advantage according to the absolute advantage theory. But according to the comparative advantage theory, a nation which has got the comparative advantage over the commodity, it should export that commodity to another nation. So the trade is governed by absolute advantage according to the absolute advantage theory, comparative advantage according to the comparative advantage theory of trade. As per the absolute advantage theory, all nations may not get a chance for export. Some nations have to import always. Why does that happen? It may happen, it will happen if there is no absolute advantage for some nations. There are possibilities that absolute advantage is possible for only a few nations. Then in that case, no trade is possible with with the nations having absolute disadvantage. Only one way trade will happen. Only export will come from one side, import will come from another side. So this is the case of one way trade traffic. This is possible if in the absolute advantage theory, but in the comparative advantage theory, all nations will get a chance for export, as this is comparatively we are just looking at if any nation has comparatively advantage on certain commodities. So if there is any comparative advantage or relative advantage compared to other commodity and other nation, so the trade will happen when comparative advantage is followed. So trade will happen from both sides. Export and import will happen from both ends when comparative advantage theory is in practice. So these are the major differences between the two nations. In short, let me brief the presentation. All the assumptions of the absolute advantage theory are also applicable for the comparative advantage theory. So classical theories of trade have common assumptions. The major differences are two. One is the trade depends on absolute advantage according to the absolute advantage theory, comparative advantage according to the comparative advantage theory, and according to the in the absolute advantage theory, there are possibilities for some nations don't get chance for export. Some nations have to import always. This is possible in absolute advantage theory, but that is not possible in comparative advantage theory, as we consider just relative advantage of commodities compared to some other commodities and other nations. Thank you.